Hello there, William Golding again with another chapter of Lord of the Flies. Just to kind of bring you up to speed, as we mentioned, the essential question last chapter was about the building conflict between Ralph and Jack, and then we gave some other information about Simon and his personality. Now we're going to kind of delve into some other conflicts that are building on the island. I want you to notice in the beginning of this particular chapter that their lives are very intense. So we're going to talk about this and how this has an impact on them and how they become more of a generalization or a symbol of society. And so we're going to see this kind of play out. As we continue on with this chapter, chapter 4, we're going to see this building conflict to the rising action. So your essential question for this particular chapter is, how does the action rise? How does the action intensify, leading us towards the climax of this story? So that's where we begin with chapter 4, Painted Faces and Long Hair. The first rhythm that they became used to was the slow swing from the dawn to quick dusk. They accepted the pleasures of the morning, the bright sun, the whelming sea and sweet air, as a time when play was good and life was so full that hope was not necessary and therefore forgotten. Toward noon, as the floods of light fell more nearly to the perpendicular, the stark colors of the morning were smooth in pearl and opalescence, and the heat, as though the impending sun's height gave it momentum, became a blow that they ducked, running to the shade and lying there, perhaps even sleeping. Strange things happened at midday. The glittering sea rose up, moved apart in plains of brilliant impossibility. The coral reef and the few stunted palms that clung to the more elevated parts would float up to the sky, would quiver, be plucked apart, run like raindrops on a wire, or be repeated as an odd succession of mirrors. Sometimes the land loomed when there was no land, and flicked out like a bubble as the children watched. If you have ever taken a drive, let's say into the desert, in the heat of the day, you'll notice that out in the distance on the road, it looks like shades of shimmering water across the road. And as you continue on, those water-like shadows disappear. And that's what these boys see in the heat of the day, the steam rising off the sand, the water looking like it's flipping over and creating this mirage, like this impossible vision that they're seeing. Piggy discounted all this learnedly as a mirage. And since no boy could even reach the reef over the stretch of water where the snapping sharks waited, they grew accustomed to these mysteries and ignored them, just as they ignored the miraculous throbbing stars. At midday, the illusions merged into the sky, and there was the sun that gazed down like an angry eye. And then, at the end of the afternoon, the mirages subsided, and the horizon became level and blue and clipped as the sun declined. And that was another time of comparative coolness, but menaced by the coming of the dark. When the sun sank, darkness dropped on the island like an extinguisher, and soon the shelters were full of restlessness under the remote stars. Nevertheless, the Northern European tradition of work, play, and food right through the day made it possible for them to adjust themselves wholly to this new rhythm. The Litland Percival had early crawled into a shelter and stayed there for 2 days, talking, singing, and crying until they thought him batty and were faintly amused. Ever since then he had been peaked, red-eyed, and miserable, a littleman who played little and cried often. The smaller boys were known by the generic title of Litlins. The decrease in size from Ralph down was gradual, and though there was the dubious region inhabited by Simon and Robert and Morris, nevertheless no one had any difficulty in recognizing Big Uns at one end and Litlins at the other. The undoubted Litlins, those aged about 6, led quite distinct and at the same time intense life of their own. They ate most of the day, picking fruit where they could reach it, and not particular about the ripeness or the quality. They were now used to stomach aches and a sort of chronic diarrhea. They suffered untold terrors in the dark and huddled together for comfort. Apart from food and sleep, they found time to play, aimless and trivial in the white sand by the bright water. They cried for their mothers much less often than might have been expected. They were very brown and filthy dirty. They obeyed the summons of the conch, partly because Ralph blew it, and he was big enough to be a link with the adult world of authority, and partly because they enjoyed the entertainment of the assemblies. But otherwise, they seldom bothered with the Big Uns, and their passionately emotional corporate life was their own. They had built castles on the sand at the bar of the little river. These castles were about a foot high and were decorated with shells and withered flowers and interesting stones. Round the castles was a complex of marks and tracks and walls and railway lines that were of significance only if inspected with the eye at beach level. The Litlins played here, if not happy at least with absorbed attention, and often as many as 3 of them would play the same game together. There were 3 playing here now. Henry was the biggest of them. He was also a distant relative of that other boy, whose mulberry-marked face had not been seen since the evening of the great fire. But he was not old enough to understand this, and if he had been told that the other boy had gone home in an aircraft, he would have accepted this statement without fuss or disbelief. Henry was a bit of a leader this afternoon, because the other 2 were Percival and Johnny, the smallest boys on the island. Percival was mouse-colored and had not been very attractive even to his mother. Johnny was well built, with fair hair and natural belligerence, and just now he was being obedient because he was interested, and the 3 children, kneeling in the sand, were at peace. Roger and Morris came out of the forest. They were relieved from the duty at the fire and had come down for a swim. Roger led the way straight through the castles, kicking them over, burying the flowers and scattering the chosen stones. So picture this older child, a Big Un, so to speak, member of the choir. And basically this particular character, Roger, after he is relieved from duty at the fire watch, decides to come down and kick all the castles that these children have built and kick them over and knock them down. Morris followed, laughing, and added to the destruction, and the 3 Litlins paused in their game and looked up. And as it happened, the particular marks in which they were interested in had not been touched, and so they made no protest. Only Percival began to whimper, with an eye full of sand, and Morris hurried away. So as Morris comes through and knocks the castles down along with Roger, he decides to kick up some sand into the face of young Percival. In his other life, Morris would have received chastisement for filling a younger's eye with sand. But now, though there was no parent to let fall a heavy hand, Morris still felt the unease of wrongdoing, and at the back of his mind formed the uncertain outlines of an excuse, and he muttered something about the swim, and he broke into a trot. So again, we have the influence of the outside world, the rules. And before someone like Morris would have gotten on this particular island, if he had, say, kicked sand in his younger brother's eye, he probably would have received punishment from his parents. But because there are no parents or no adults around to monitor what's going on, Morris decides to take advantage, and he kicks sand into Percival's eye. And he felt guilty about doing it, but rather than actually apologizing to Percival for doing this terrible thing, he just carries on business as usual. Roger remained, watching the Litlins. He was not noticeably darker than when he had dropped in, but the shock of black hair down to his nape was low on his forehead, seemed to suit his gloomy face, and he made what had seemed at first an unsociable remoteness into something foreboding. Percival finished his whimper and went on playing, for the tears had washed the sand away. Johnny watched him with china blue eyes, and then began to fling up sand in a shower, and presently Percival was crying again. So, taking the cue from the older boys, Johnny decides to throw sand into Percival's face himself. When Henry, tired of his play, had wandered off along the beach, Roger followed him, keeping beneath the palms and drifting casually in the same direction. Henry walked at a distance from the palms in the shade because he was too young to keep himself out of the sun. He went down to the beach and busied himself at the water's edge. The great Pacific tide was coming in, and every few seconds the relatively still water of the lagoon heaved forwards an inch. And there were creatures that lived in this last fling of the sea, tiny transparencies that came questing in with the water over the hot, dry sand. If you've ever been to the beach and watched the waves move in and out, and you see the bubbles, and those are sand crabs that are coming out of the holes in the bubbles, and they scurry along the beach and pick up things and then go back into their holes. And when the waves come over, and then they go out, and then the crabs come up again and look around and then jet back into the hole, and the waves come. This is the rhythm that I'm talking about. In the beginning part of this chapter, the rhythm of the sea coming in and out. And as the sea comes in and then goes out, the boys scurry around. And then when it gets dark and they go into the hole, the waves come in and go out, and then they scurry around. That's the mood that I'm attempting to establish in this particular portion of this chapter. With impalpable organs of sense, they examined this new field. Perhaps food had appeared where their last incursion there had been none. Bird droppings and insects, perhaps, any of the strewn detritus of landward life. Like a myriad of tiny teeth in a saw, the transparencies came scavenging over the beach. This was fascinating to Henry. He poked with a bit of a stick that itself was wave-worn and whitened and vagrant, and tried to control the motions of the scavengers. He made little runnels that the tide would fill in and tried to crowd them with creatures. He became absorbed beyond mere happiness as he felt himself exercising control over living things. So picture this little boy poking at these sand crabs with his stick, amusing himself, entertaining himself, directing these crabs to do whatever he wants them to do, perhaps even stabbing some of them. He talked to them, urging them, ordering them. Driven back by the tide, his footprints became bays in which they were trapped and gave him the illusion of mastery. He squatted on his hams at the water's edge. He bowed, and with a shock of hair falling over his forehead and past his eyes, and the afternoon sun emptied down its invisible arrows. Roger waited too. At first he was hidden behind the great palm, but Henry's absorption with the transparencies was so obvious that at last he stood out of full view. He looked along the beach. Percival had gone off, crying, and Johnny was left in triumphant possession of the castles, and he, sat there, crooning to himself and throwing sand at an imaginary Percival. Beyond him, Roger could see the platform and the glints of spray where Ralph and Simon and Piggy and Morris were diving in the pool. He listened carefully, but could only just hear them. A sudden breeze shook the fringe of palms, so that the fronds tossed and fluttered. 60 feet above Roger, several nuts, fibrous lumps as big as rugby balls, were loosened from their stems, and they fell about him with a series of hard thumps, and he was not touched. Roger did not consider his escape, but he looked from the nuts to Henry and back again. The subsoil beneath the palm trees was a raised beach, and generations of palms had worked loose in this and the stones that had laid on the sands of another shore. Roger stooped and picked up a stone. He aimed and threw it at Henry. Threw it to miss. The stone, that token of a preposterous time, bounced 5 yards to Henry's right and fell into the water. Roger gathered a handful of stones and began to throw them. Yet there was this space around Henry, perhaps 6 yards in diameter, in which he dare not throw. Here, invisible yet strong, was the taboo of the old life. Round the squatting child was the protection of parents and school and policemen and the law. Roger's arm was conditioned by civilization that knew nothing of him and was in ruins. So let's stop here for a second. So imagine Roger picking up stones and throwing them at this small child about 6 years of age. And as he throws the stones, there's this natural level of protection around this little boy that Roger's arm was conditioned by society. That throwing stones at little children is probably not a good thing to do. That you could injure someone, you could hurt someone really bad, possibly even kill them. But as the story continues, you'll notice that this circle of protection around these small boys, that society's influence on Roger's arm will continue to decrease and decrease and decrease, especially because at this current moment in the book, there is no society. There is no civilization. It is all blown to hell. The subsoil beneath the palm trees was a raised beach. Henry was surprised by the plopping sounds in the water. He abandoned the noiseless transparencies, and he pointed at the center of the spreading reins like a setter. This side and that the stones fell, and Henry turned obediently, but always too late to see the stones in the air. At last he saw one and laughed, looking for the friend who was teasing him. But Roger had whipped behind the palm again, and was leaning against it, breathing quickly, and his eyelids fluttering. And then Henry lost interest in the stones, and he wandered off. "Roger!" Jack was standing under the tree about 10 yards away. When Roger opened his eyes and saw him, a dark shadow crept beneath the swarthiness of his skin, but Jack noticed nothing. He was eager, impatient, beckoning, so that Roger went to him. There was a small pool at the end of the river, dammed back by sand and full of white water lilies and needle-like reeds. Here Sam and Eric were waiting, and Bill and Jack, concealed from the sun, knelt by the pool and opened the 2 large leaves that he carried. One of them contained white clay and the other red. And by them he lay a stick of charcoal brought down from the fire. Jack explained to Roger as he worked. "They don't smell me, they see me. I think something pink under the trees," and he smeared on the clay. "If only I had some green." He turned a half-concealed face up to Roger and answered the incomprehension of his gaze. "It's for hunting. Like in war. You know, dazzle paint. Like things trying to look like something else. and he twisted in the urgency of his telling. Like moths on a tree trunk. Roger understood and nodded gravely. The twins moved toward Jack and began to protest timidly about something, but Jack waved them away. Shut up! And he rubbed the charcoal stick between the patches of red and white on his face. No! You two, come with me! He peered at his reflection and disliked it, and he bent down and he took a double handful of lukewarm water and rubbed the mess from his face, and freckles and sandy eyebrows appeared. Roger smiled unwillingly. You don't look like half a mess. Jack planned his new face. He made one cheek and one eye socket white, and then rubbed red over the other half of his face and slashed a black bar of charcoal right across the ear from the left jaw. And then he looked in the pool in his reflection, but breathing troubled the mirror. Sam and Eric, get me a coconut, an empty one. And he knelt, holding the shell of water. A rounded patch of sunlight fell on his face, and brightness appeared in the depths of the water, and he looked in astonishment, no longer at himself, but this awesome stranger. He spilt the water and leapt to his feet, laughing excitedly. And beside the pool, his sinewy body held up the mask that drew their eyes and appalled them. And he began to dance, and his laughter became bloodthirsty, snarling. Ha ha ha! And he capered toward Bill. Ha ha! The mask was a thing of its own, behind which Jack hid, liberated from shame and self-consciousness. The face of red and white and black swung through the air and jigged toward Bill, and Bill started up laughing, and then suddenly he fell silent and blundered away through the bushes. Jack rushed toward the twins. The rest are making a line! Come on! But we... Come on! I'll creep up and stab! And the mask compelled them. So what I want to say to you is this. Think about why Jack is painting his face. He says it's for hunting, to conceal his face so the pigs don't see. But what other reasons do people wear masks? Think about bank robbers. Think about criminals. To hide their face from authority, to be able to do things that are not necessarily good things to do, yet still retain their anonymity. And then rather than the twins watching the fire like they're supposed to, instead, Jack compels them to break the rules and to go help him go find a pig and kill it. Ralph climbed out of the bathing pool and trotted up the beach and sat in the shade beneath the palms. His fair hair was plastered over his eyebrows and he pushed it back. Simon was floating in the water and kicking with his feet, and Morris was practicing diving. Piggy was mooning about aimlessly, picking up things and discarding them. The rock pools which so fascinated him were covered by the tide, so he was without an interest until the tide went back. And presently, seeing Ralph under the palms, he came and sat by him. Piggy wore the remainders of a pair of shorts. His fat body was golden brown, and his glasses still flashed when he looked at anything. He was the only boy on the island whose hair never seemed to grow. The rest were shock-headed, but Piggy's hair still lay in wisps over his head as though baldness were his natural state, and this imperfect covering would soon go, like the velvet on a young stag's antlers. I've been thinking, he said, about a clock. Oh, we could make a sundial. We could put a stick in the sand. And then... The effort to express the mathematical processes involved was too great, and he made a few passes instead. So, why would Piggy want to make a clock on the island? Ask yourself that question. For what reason would someone need a clock on the island? Think about the fire. Think about the fire watch. Why would someone need a clock on this island? and watch what happens next. So Piggy comes up with this brilliant idea about keeping a clock and figuring out a way to keep track of time so that he could schedule people on the fire watch. And look at Ralph's reaction to this brilliant idea. And an airplane, and a TV set, said Ralph sourly, and a steam engine. And Piggy shook his head. Well, you have to have a lot of metal things for that, he said, and we haven't got no metal, but we got a stick. Ralph turned and smiled involuntarily. Piggy was a bore. His fat and his asthma and his matter-of-fact ideas were dull. But there was always a little pleasure to be got out of pulling his leg, even if he did it by accident. Piggy saw this smile and misinterpreted it as friendliness. There had grown up tacitly among the Biggins the opinion that Piggy was an outsider, not only by accent, which did not matter, but by fat, and asthma, and specs, and a certain disinclination for manual labor. And now, finding that something he had said made Ralph smile, he rejoiced and pressed his advantage. Well, we got lots of sticks. We could have a sundial each, and then we should know what the time was. A fat lot of good that would be. Well, you said you wanted to get things done, so as we could be rescued. Oh, shut up! He leapt to his feet and trotted back to the pool just as Morris did a rather poor dive, and Ralph was glad for a chance to change the subject, and he shouted as Morris came to the surface, "Belly flop! Belly flop!" Morris flashed a smile at Ralph, who slid easily into the water. And all of the boys, he was the most at home there, but today, irked by this mention of rescue, the useless foot-long mention of rescue, even the green depths of the water and the shattered golden sun held no balm. Instead of remaining and playing, he swam with steady strokes under Simon, and he crawled out on the other side of the pool, and he lay there, sleek and streaming like a seal. Piggy, always clumsy, stood up and came to stand by him, so that Ralph rolled on his stomach and pretended not to see. The mirages had died away, and gloomily he ran his eye along the top blue line of the horizon. In the next moment he was on his feet, shouting, "Smoke! Smoke!" Simon tried to sit up in the water and got a mouthful. Morris, who had been standing ready to dive, swayed back on his heels, made a bolt for the platform, and then swerved back to the grass under the palms. And there he started to pull on his tattered shorts, to be ready for anything. Ralph stood, one hand holding his hair back and the other clenched. Simon was climbing out of the water. Piggy was rubbing his glasses on his shorts and squinting at the sea. Morris got both legs through one leg of his shorts, and all of the boys, only Ralph was still. "Well, I can't see no smoke," said Piggy incredulously. "I can't see no smoke, Ralph. Where is it?" Ralph said nothing. Now both hands were clenched over his forehead so that his fair hair was kept out of his eyes, and then he was leaning forward, and already the salt was whitening his body. "Ralph! Where's the ship?" Simon stood by, looking from Ralph to the horizon. Morris's trousers gave way with a sigh, and he abandoned them as a wreck, and he rushed toward the forest and then came back again. The smoke was a tight little knot on the horizon, and was uncoiling slowly. Beneath the smoke was a dot that might be a funnel, and Ralph's face was pale as he spoke to himself. "There's your smoke!" Piggy was looking in the right direction now. "It don't look like much." He turned round and peered up the mountain. Ralph continued to watch the ship. He turned round and peered up the mountain. Ralph continued to watch the ship ravenously. Colour was coming back to his face, and Simon stood by him silent. "I know I can't see very much," said Piggy, "but have we got any smoke?" Ralph moved impatiently, still watching the ship. "The smoke on the mountain!" Morris came running and stared out to the sea. Both Simon and Piggy were looking up at the mountain. Piggy screwed up his face, but Simon cried out as though he had hurt himself. "Ralph! quality of his speech twisted Ralph on the sand. "You tell me," said Piggy anxiously. "Is there a signal?" Ralph looked back at the disappearing smoke on the horizon and then up at the mountain. "Ralph, please! Is there a signal?" Simon put out his hand timidly to touch Ralph, but Ralph started to run, splashing through the shallow end of the bathing pool across the hot white sand and under the trees, and a moment later he was battling with the complex undergrowth that was already engulfing the sky. Simon ran after him, and then Morris, and then Piggy shouted, "Ralph! Please! Ralph!" And then he too started to run, stumbling over Morris's discarded shorts before he was across the terrace. Behind the four boys, the smoke moved gently along the horizon, and on the beach, Henry and Johnny were throwing sand at Percival, who was crying quietly again, and all three were in complete ignorance of the excitement. And by the time that Ralph had reached the landward end of the scar, he was using precious breath to swear. He did desperate violence to his naked body among the rasping creepers, so that blood was sliding over him, and just where the steep ascent of the mountain began, he stopped. Morris was only a few yards behind him. "Piggy Specs!" shouted Ralph. "If the fire's out, we'll need them!" He stopped shouting and swaying on his feet. Piggy was only just visible, bumbling up from the beach. Ralph looked at the horizon and then up to the mountain. Which was better, fetching Piggy's glasses, or would the ship have gone? Or if he climbed on, supposing the fire was out, and they had to watch Piggy crawling nearer and the ship sinking under the horizon. Balanced on the high peak of need, agonized by this indecision, Ralph cried out, "Oh God! Oh God!" Simon, struggling with the bushes, caught his breath. His face was twisted. Ralph blundered on, savaging himself, as the wisp of smoke moved on. The fire was dead. They saw that straight away. Saw what they had really known down on the beach when the smoke of home had beckoned. The fire was out, smokeless and dead. The watchers were gone. A pile of unused fuel lay ready. Ralph turned to the sea. The horizon stretched, impersonal once more, barren of all the faintest traces of smoke. Ralph ran stumbling along the rocks, saved himself on the edge of the pink cliff, and screamed at the ship, "Stop! Come back! Come back!" He ran backwards and forwards along the cliff, his face always to the sea. His voice rose insanely. Simon and Morris arrived. Ralph looked at them with unwinking eyes. Simon turned away, smearing the water from his cheeks. Ralph reached inside himself for the worst word he knew. "They've let the bloody fire out!" He looked down the unfriendly side of the mountain. Piggy arrived, out of breath and whimpering like a littling. Ralph clenched his fist and went very red. The intentness of his gaze, the bitterness of his voice pointed for him. "There they are." A procession had appeared. Far down among the pink stones that lay near the water's edge, some of the boys wore black caps, but otherwise they were almost naked. They lifted their sticks in the air, and whenever they came to an easy patch, and they were chanting, something to do with the bundle that the errant twins carried so carefully. Ralph picked out Jack easily, even at this distance, tall, red-haired, and inevitably leading the procession. Simon looked now from Ralph to Jack, and he had looked from Ralph to the horizon, and what he saw made him feel afraid. Ralph said nothing more, but waited while the procession came nearer. The chant was audible, but at the distance still wordless. Behind Jack walked the twins carrying a great stake on their shoulders. The gutted carcass of a pig swung from the stake, swinging heavily as the twins toiled over the uneven ground. The pig's head hung down with a gaping neck and seemed to search for something on the ground. At last the words of the chant floated up to them across the bowl of blackened wood and ashes. "Kill the pig, cut her throat, spill her blood." Yet as the words became audible, the procession reached the steepest part of the mountain, and in a minute or two the chanting died away. Piggy sniveled, and Simon shushed him quickly as though he had spoken too loudly in church. Jack, his face smeared with clays, reached the top first and hailed Ralph excitedly with the lifted spear. "Look! We've killed a pig! We stole up on them! We got in a circle!" Voices broke in from the hunters. "We got in a circle! We crept up! The pig squealed!" The twins stood with the pig swinging between them, dropping black guts on the rock. They seemed to share one wide, ecstatic grin. Jack had too many things to tell Ralph at once. Instead, he danced a step or two, and then he remembered his dignity and stood still, grinning. He noticed the blood on his hands and grimaced distastefully and looking for something which to clean them, and then he wiped them on his shorts and he laughed. Ralph spoke.
"You let the fire out."
Jack checked, vaguely irritated by this irrelevance, but too happy to let it worry him.
"We can light it up again."
"You should have been with us, Ralph. We had a smashing time. The twins got knocked over. We hit the pig. I fell on top. I cut the pig's throat," said Jack proudly, and yet twitched as he said it. "Can I borrow yours, Ralph, to make a nick in the hilt?" The boys chatted and danced. The twins continued to grin. "There were lashings of blood," said Jack, laughing and shuddering. "You should have seen it." "We'll go hunting every day." Ralph spoke again hoarsely. He had not moved. "You let the fire go out." This repetition made Jack uneasy. He looked at the twins and then back at Ralph. "Well, we had to have them for the hunt," he said, "or there wouldn't have been enough for a ring." He flushed, conscious of a fault. "The fire's only been out an hour or two. We can light it up again." He'd noticed Ralph's scarred nakedness and somber silence of all four of them. He sought, charitable in this happiness, to include them in the thing that had happened. His mind was crowded with memories. Memories of the knowledge that had come to them when they closed in on the struggling pig. Knowledge that they had outwitted a living thing, imposed their will upon it, taken away its life like a long, satisfying drink. Okay, now, I did this on purpose. Remember back in the first chapter, I made a reference about this tropical island paradise that was very similar to the Garden of Eden. And in the Genesis story in the Bible, the Garden of Eden, there are many trees that bear fruit, and God tells Adam and Eve that they can have any of the fruit. All of the fruit is theirs to eat. But he gave them one rule. "But you may not eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil." And he told that to Adam and Eve. But Eve could not resist the temptation. She is told by the serpent that the reason why God doesn't want you to eat of this tree is because you will have knowledge like God. You will know the difference between good and evil. And so she ate the fruit. She offered the same fruit to her husband, and both of them ate the fruit. And now, once they ate the fruit, they knew the difference between good and evil. They didn't know the concept of evil. They had no idea what evil was. And then when they ate the fruit, they knew all the things that they could do that would be considered evil by God. And so, yes, the pigs are there for them to hunt. Yes, the pigs are there for them to kill and eat. However, look how they do it. They take joy and pleasure and satisfaction in the killing of another living being. Very similar to Henry's experience, playing with the little sand crabs with his stick. And now that these boys have taken the life of a being and been happy about it, say that they're going to go hunting every day because they enjoy killing. Don't you think that kind of crosses the line a little? Where is this heading? Think about that as we look at the rising action heading toward the climax. In other words, the stones are going to get closer and closer and closer and closer until there is no circle of protection any longer. He spread his arms wide. You should have seen the blood! The hunters were more silent now. But at this they buzzed again, and Ralph flung back his hair. One arm was pointed at the empty horizon, and his voice was loud and savage, and he struck them into silence. There was a ship! Jack's face, at once, with too many awful implications, ducked away from them, and he laid a hand on the pig and drew his knife. Ralph brought his arm down and clenched his fist, and his voice shook. There was a ship out there! You said you'd keep the fire going, and you let it out! He took a step toward Jack. He turned to face him. They might have seen us! We might have gone home! This was too bitter for Piggy, who forgot his timidity in the agony of loss, and he began to cry out shrilly. You and your blood, Jack Merridew! You and your hunting! We might have gone home! Ralph pushed Piggy to one side. I was chief, and you were going to do what I said! And you talk! But you can't even build huts, and then you go off hunting and you let out the fire! He turned away for a moment, and then his voice came again on the peak of feeling. There was a ship! One of the smaller hunters began to wail. The dismal truth was filtering through everybody, and Jack went very red as he hacked and he pulled at the pig. The job was too much. We needed everyone. Ralph turned. You could have had everyone when the shelters were finished, but you had to hunt! Well, we needed meat. Jack stood up as he said this, the bloodied knife in his hands. The two boys faced each other. There was the brilliant world of hunting and tactics and fierce exhilaration and skill, and then there was the world of longing and baffled common sense. Jack transferred the knife to his left hand, and he smudged blood over his forehead as he pushed down the plastered hair. And Piggy began again. You did not want to let that fire out! You said you'd keep the smoke going! This from Piggy and the wails of agreement from some of the hunters drove Jack to violence. The bolting look came into his blue eyes, and he took a step, and able at last to hit someone, he struck his fist into Piggy's stomach. Piggy sat down with a grunt, and Jack stood over him, and his voice was vicious with humiliation. Oh, you would you, fatty? Ralph made a step toward Jack, and Jack smacked Piggy's head.
My specs! Here. Here they are.
Jack made a move toward Piggy, who scrambled away until a great rock lay between them, and he thrust his head over the top and glared at Jack through one flashing glass. Now I only got one eye, just you wait! And Jack mimicked a whine and scramble. Just you wait, yeah! Piggy in this parody was so funny that the hunters began to laugh. And Jack felt encouraged, and he went on scrambling, and the laughter rose to a gale of hysteria. Unwillingly, Ralph felt his lips twitch. He was angry with himself for giving way, and he muttered, Well, that was a dirty trick. Jack broke out of his gyration and stood facing Ralph, and his words came in a shout. All right, all right. He looked at Piggy and the hunters and at Ralph.
All right, I'm sorry. About the fire, I mean. There. I apologize.
The buzz went from the hunters, one of admiration at this handsome behavior, Clearly, there was the opinion that Jack had done the decent thing and had put himself in the right by this generous apology, and Ralph obscurely in the wrong. They waited for an apology and a decent answer, yet Ralph's throat refused to pass one. He resented, and as an addition to Jack's misbehavior, this verbal trick, the fire was dead and the ship was gone. Could they not see? Anger instead of decency passed his throat. Well, that was a dirty trick. They went on silent on the mountaintop, while the opaque look appeared in Jack's eyes and passed away. Ralph's final word was an ingracious mutter. All right. Light the fire. With some positive action before them, and a little of the tension died, Ralph said no more, did nothing, looking down at the ashes round his feet. Jack was loud and active, and he gave orders, and he sang, and he whistled, and threw remarks at the silent Ralph, remarks that did not need an answer, and therefore could not invite a snub. And still Ralph was silent. No one, not even Jack, would ask him to move, and in the end they had to build the fire 3 yards away, in a place not really as convenient. So Ralph asserted his chiefmanship, and could not have chosen a better way if he had thought for days. Against this weapon, so indefinable yet so effective, Jack was powerless, and raged without knowing why. And by the time the pile was built, they were on different sides of a high barrier. When they had dealt with the fire, another crisis arose. Jack had no means of lighting it. Then, to his surprise, Ralph went to Piggy and took the glasses from him.
No, Ralph, don't, please. I'll bring them back.
Piggy stood behind him, islanded in the sea of meaningless color, while Ralph knelt and focused the glossy spot, and instantly the fire was alight, and Piggy held out his hands and grabbed the glasses back. Before the fantastically attractive flowers of violet and red and yellow, unkindness melted away. They became a circle of boys round a campfire, and even Piggy and Ralph were half drawn in. Soon some of the boys were rushing down the slope for more wood, while Jack hacked at the pig. They tried holding the whole carcass on a stake over the fire, but the stake burnt more quickly than the pig roasted. In the end, they skewered bits of meat on branches and held them in the flames, and even then, almost as much boy was roasted as meat. Ralph's mouth watered. He meant to refuse meat, but his past diet of fruit and nuts, with an odd crab or fish, gave him too little resistance. He accepted a piece of half-raw meat and gnawed at it like a wolf. Piggy spoke, also dribbling.
Aren't I having none?
You didn't hunt.
No more did Ralph, no more did Simon.
There isn't more than half a pult of meat in a crowd. Ralph stirred uneasily. Simon, sitting between the twins and Piggy, wiped his mouth and shoved a piece of meat over the rocks to Piggy, who grabbed it. The twins giggled and Simon lowered his face in shame. And then Jack leapt across on his feet, slashed a great hunk of meat, and flung it down at Simon's feet.
Eat, damn you.
He glared at Simon. Take it! He spoke on his heel, center of bewildered circle of boys. I got you, meat! Numberless and inexpressible frustrations combined to make his rage elemental and awe-inspiring. I painted my face! I stole up, and now you eat! All of you! And I... Slowly the silence on top of the mountain deepened until the click of the fire and the soft hiss of the roasting meat could be heard clearly. Jack looked round for understanding, but found only respect. Ralph stood among the ashes of the signal fire, and his hands were full of meat, saying nothing. Then at last, Morris broke the silence. He changed the subject to the only one that could bring the majority of them together. Where did you find the pig? Roger pointed down the unfriendly side. They were there, by the sea. Jack, recovering, could not bear to have his story told, so he broke in quickly. We spread round, and I crept on my hands and knees. The spears fell out because they hadn't barbs on, And then the pig ran away and made an awful noise. It turned back and ran into the circle, bleeding. All the boys were talking at once, relieved and excited. And we closed in! The first blow had paralyzed its hindquarters so that the circle could close in and beat and beat and beat. And I cut the pig's throat! The twins, still sharing their identical grin, jumped up and ran round each other. And then the rest joined in, making pig dying noises and shouting, "One for his knob! Give him a fourpenny one!" And then Morris pretended to be the pig and ran squealing into the center, and the hunter, circling still, pretended to beat him, and they danced, and they sang.
Kill a pig, let us go, batter in, 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 kill a pig, let us go, batter in.
Get down on the beach. I'm calling an assembly.
One by one, they halted and stood watching him. "With the conch! I'm calling a meeting, even if we have to go into the dark! Down on the platform when I blow it! Now!" And he turned away and walked off down the mountain.